Welcome, everybody, to the American Library in Paris, and thank you for joining us tonight for Entre, Nous. Isn't that a great name? Entre Nous is a co-sponsored program with the Columbia, I always get this mixed up, Columbia Global Paris Center and the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination and the American Library in Paris. My name is Mayanne Wright, and I'm the docent here at the library, and I help out with these evening events. How many of you have never been to the American Library in Paris before? Welcome. Well, there are two facts that you should know. We are over 100 years old, and we are the largest English language lending library on the European continent. This is who we are. And tonight we're delighted to welcome Seth Kimmel and Lauren Robertson. Tonight they're going to discuss how a model of a library was used as a tool of Spanish colonialism. The conversation will run about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So let me tell you a little bit about our distinguished speakers. Seth is an associate professor in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia University, where he teaches the literature and culture of early modern Spain. He is the author of 2 books, both published by the University of Chicago Press, The Librarian's Atlas, The Shape of Knowledge in Early Modern Spain, and Parables of Coercion, Conversion and Knowledge at the End of Islamic Spain. Lauren Robertson is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University as well, where she works on early modern literature and culture. She's the author of Entertaining Uncertainty in the Early Modern Theater, Stage Spectacle, and Audience Response. And her recent essays appear in Shakespeare Quarterly, English Literary Renaissance, and Theater Journal. She currently is a fellow at the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris, where she is at work on her next book project, An Account of Shared Aesthetics of Race-Making and Classical Revival of English Renaissance. Will you please help me welcome them with some applause? Thank you.
Okay, let's get started.
Hi, thanks for doing this.
Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to talk with you about your new book, Seth, which, to my mind, in some ways, since so many questions about libraries, I think, are at our own cultural forefront right now in many different ways. One of the things that your book does that's so exciting, I think, is remind us that so many of these questions about library access, about the control of knowledge, among many other things, have long histories. So I'm excited to dive into that. I thought that we might start with the fascinating figure with which the book itself begins, a man named Hernando Colón, who was the son of Christopher Columbus. Unlike his father, he was not an imperial explorer, but was a librarian. And you make, if I'm getting this right, I think the kind of fascinating claim in the book that although it sort of seems there like the apple fell pretty far from the tree in that case, that father and son actually kind of did the same job in many respects. So can you tell us more about him and about that connection?
Have you all heard of Hernando Colón before? No? Okay, so he was one of the sons of Christopher Columbus. And he had one of the largest private libraries of the Renaissance. So he was a very ambitious book collector. He did actually travel to the New World. He was marooned on Jamaica for quite some time.
Yeah, he didn't have a good time, is what I learned from your book.
But yeah, so he's most famous as a collector. He also was a cosmographer for Philip II. So he was involved in mapping and other kind of scientific bureaucratic work in Seville, where he was based. And so I became interested in this relationship between his work as a cosmographer and his work as a librarian, as a collector. It also is the case that Seville was the bureaucratic hub of the Spanish imperial project, scientific and bureaucratic hub of the Spanish imperial project. And so his library became an important space for for pilot exams, for example, or for other kinds of meetings having to do with travel to the New World. So although his library was a private space and his collection was a private collection, he was very much intertwined with some of the work that was happening in other institutions based in Seville.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which, would it be right to say that Colón's bibliographic or cosmographic mindset was shaped by his father's imperial ambition, or the other way around? I mean, is it right to think of them as having a kind of similar approach to the world that they lived in?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, his father was interested in conquering territories, and the son Hernando became most obsessed with acquiring books, and so that relationship between territories and texts became part of Hernando Colón's own self-representation. In his shield, in his kind of family decorations, right, in his house, he emphasized that parallel between acquiring territories and acquiring books. So that's something that is kind of important to his self-representation. Mm-hmm. So I think that he oversells it for his own professional reasons. I think he's a bibliophile, and part of the way to fund his library, especially after his death, he was seeking royal funding, is to emphasize the kind of imperial stakes of book collection. He was idiosyncratic in his collecting priorities. Most other private collectors from the early part of the 16th century were interested in buying up manuscripts. Really, the older and more rare the manuscript, the better. Whereas Colón famously bought everything he could get his hands on, all sorts of printed materials, including popular pamphlets, ephemeral texts that may end up wrapping fruit in the market rather than on the shelves of a library. And so that made him, again, idiosyncratic in a very interesting way. It also means that his catalogs tell us a lot about books and pamphlets and other materials that no longer exist, or that, as far as we know, no longer exist. So the catalogs are a test to lost books. I guess you haven't heard much about Hernando Colón, but he was in the news over the last few years because one of his catalogs that was believed to be lost was rediscovered in Copenhagen, and it contains summaries of many of his books. So this was kind of the missing piece for the story about Colón's strategies of information management. So he had several different volumes organized, volumes of catalogs, some organized alphabetically by author, others organized by the order in which he bought them. He annotated in his books the place and cost of the book, so economic historians are very interested in his collection and his catalogs. He has these kind of harebrained annotation system for describing the folio size, the number of pages, the kinds of images. I mean, if you're a book collector, one of your primary concerns is to make sure that you or your agents don't go out and buy the same book again. And so some of the cataloging was an effort to expand the collection in kind of an organized and systematic way.
We must have a sense then from those catalogs what motivated his process of collecting, or what kinds of materials he was really interested in acquiring?
So he was a humanist. So he had the typical humanistic interests, ranging across philosophy, history, law. But he really did gravitate towards the fields whose materials were cheaper and more readily accessible. So he was less interested, I'd say, in the big juridical tome that would be very expensive and acquired at some important book fair of the period, and much more interested in the ephemeral materials. This is not to say, I mean, his library, what remains of his library is currently in it's housed in the Seville Cathedral. About a third of it remains together, and it is a very important and esteemed library with many, very expensive, large tomes. That's because a lot of the more ephemeral material got lost along the way. So it's not to say that that stuff wasn't there, but he's sort of famous for his ecumenical approach to buying everything, regardless of whether it appeared to be important in the moment. So and of course, one thing that interests me in the book is to figure out, okay, so he's a cosmographer and he's also a bibliographer. What does he think about what counts as cosmography in the moment? So what is he buying and cataloging as cosmography? So one of the things that I did in the early chapters of my book is to go to his catalogs and look up the word cosmografia and see what's there. And then you kind of get a history of the field. So you get a history of libraries because you're seeing how his catalogs are put together, but you also get a sense for what Hernando Colón and his contemporaries believed ought to be an important work in the field of cosmography. And so that's something that I do throughout the book. There's a lot of catalogs that I study, but I don't offer a kind of poetics of the catalog or a kind of theory of the mapping of library space is something that interests me. But I'm interested in using catalogs and trying to understand how they might have been used in the 16th century, also. So Colón was a kind of starting point. And even for his contemporaries who were writing the history of libraries in the early 16th and late 16th century, they also used Colón as a kind of bookend for their histories of libraries, much the way I do. The early part of the book is about Colón, but then I shift to other collections and the influence of Colón's bibliographic methods in other places, particularly in the Escorial, which occupies the middle part of the book.
Mm-hmm. We should talk about the Escorial. And I'm curious about it as a particularly important example of sort of what counts as and what constitutes the library in the early modern context, in the early modern Spanish context specifically. What goes on in the early modern library? What's included within it? And what is it for? And is it for the same things that we think of as a library being for now?
Yeah, so these are great questions. People who study early modern Spain or who study the history of libraries will say, oh, well, the Escorial is so different from Colón's library. What are they doing together in the same book? Because the Escorial collection grew out of gifts largely by private collectors who had an older set of priorities. They were buying up manuscripts, the older the better, often focusing on Greek and Latin manuscripts. And those private collections eventually in the 1560s, 1570s, 1580s, when the Escorial was being founded and organized, those other private collections ended up incorporated into the Escorial collection. So the Escorial collection looks different. It's manuscript heavy. Of course, over the course of time, many printed books also became part of the collection. But when it began, it was a place for consolidating manuscript culture all in one place. And the presence of all those manuscripts there made it possible then to print authoritative printed works of some of those authors. So, for example, Isidore of Seville, who has encyclopedic interests of his own, the authoritative early modern edition of Isidore of Seville was produced based on manuscripts that were collected for the Escorial and were printed, in collaboration with Escorial humanists. So again, that's a totally different model of collection. It's a different kind of universality, but there's a kind of a strand of shared encyclopedism that runs through a private collection like Hernando Colón's and the royal collection at the Escorial.
Mm-hmm. And so who, in some ways you've started to touch on this question already. Who's using the Escorial in this period? Who has access to these collections, and sort of how open should we think of that collection as being in this period?
Yeah, so the Escorial was not particularly accessible. Humanists of the period were very angry that the Escorial was built where it was, about an hour outside of Madrid, and not in a major, not in Valladolid, for example, not in Sevilla, which had other royal institutions, it would have made sense to put it there. And the humanists were angry that it was placed in this out of the way location, in part because they thought it made it more difficult to use. One commentator of the period said books go there to be buried like in a cemetery, which is to say it's not used too much.
Grim.
However, there was a lot of activity there, of course. It was a site where there was a very important collection of Arabic and Hebrew materials at the Escorial. So philologists, humanists of the period who had interest in Semitic philology gravitated to that place. The first librarian of the Escorial was a guy named Benito Arias Montano, who was the kind of editorial director of a polyglot Bible produced in Antwerp, another royal project that has a kind of universalist, encyclopedic aspiration, and he was a famous Hebrist. That's why he got that job. So there were people passing through the Escorial who had those kinds of interests. There was an alchemical laboratory on the Escorial campus. There, at various points, there was some printing going on there. There were diplomats who would pass through. King Philip II had a residence there. He was occasionally there. It became also a mausoleum. There were monks who lived there as part of the monastic, their monastic work. So there was activity, but it wasn't a kind of American library in Paris where people gravitate for interesting events and have readily accessible books in the languages that they prefer to read in.
Yeah.
So that's the quick answer.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that thinking of the library as you describe it in the book, as a site for not only a kind of repository for knowledge, but the production of knowledge, that the Escorial, people in the Escorial are quite literally making things, whether it's new printed material or gold out of lead in the alchemical laboratory, presumably. There's a way in which that sort of desire for knowledge production is kind of continually undermining this quest for comprehensiveness or totality of the collection. There's sort of always more to be made, more to be created at the site of the library itself.
There was, I always have trouble tracking down the precise reference, but there was in the moment a desire to have every printed book produced, have a copy of it placed in the Escorial, kind of like the Library of Congress, I believe functions like that. But yes, this is the problem with the desire for comprehensiveness, which is that it's an elusive goal, as Hernando Colón very quickly discovered. I mean, Hernando Colón, in the early part of the 16th century, when print is still growing, maybe it seems possible for a few decades to actually own every printed object, right? Every printed artifact that gets produced. But by the end of the 16th century, that's impossible. And so the sense of what ought to count as comprehensive shifts and adapts. And maybe we can get to this later, or we can talk about it in the question and answer period. I mean, if you look at Google's marketing materials, they talk about a desire for readily accessible knowledge anywhere, anytime, kind of a language of encyclopedism and comprehensiveness. So that dream is very much still alive, even if, of course, money shapes what kinds of information you actually see, and not everybody has access to the same tools, electronic tools in our case, or free time to go Googling stuff. So just to say that accessibility, like universality, is also a kind of moving target.
Yeah, that's great. I am wondering, is it okay if I take us into the present for a moment? We can go back into the past as soon as you're ready to. But I just read this article that was in the New Yorker recently about this sort of nefarious rare book stealer named Glenn Horowitz. Did anybody just read this profile? It's fascinating for many reasons, but among other things, Horowitz is sort of invented the market for authors, writers, archives. I mean, for many years, he has convinced university libraries in particular that it would be a very good idea for them to spend lots of money to acquire the archives of famous authors. recently, this profile details that has started to become a harder sell, in part because libraries have limited space for new acquisitions, that universities have started to constrain acquisitions librarians to a certain number of linear feet per year, right, of new material that they're allowed to acquire. So that just seemed to me to make this issue of the elusive goal of comprehensiveness really visible, sort of from the other end of the spectrum. The problem is at one end, the impossibility of acquiring everything that exists. The other is the very practical problem of space, that even if you could do that, there's not enough room to hold everything, right? And I think we know this very well on Columbia's campus, which has space issues of many kinds. So I guess I'm just wondering, if the figures that you're thinking about, once the quest for comprehensiveness in some ways becomes recognizably elusive or impossible, what is the solution? Or what alternatives do people come up with? If that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, so it's a great question with I have a series of smart retorts to the. I mean, I think often. I haven't read this article. I let my New Yorker subscription lapse while I'm spending the year in Seville.
I'll send you a gift article.
I think space is often a red herring for a lack of will.
Ah, interesting.
And so, I mean, you talked about Columbia's collection. I mean, there was a lot of hand-wringing about removing much of the collection to warehouses in New Jersey, and to share that collection with the New York Public Library and Princeton and other university libraries. So that means, on the one hand, that means there's plenty of space, but there's fewer books, right? In general, that means you're not going to have 3 copies of the same book. You're going to have 1 copy in New Jersey that you request. And so that slows down research, but it facilitates the growth of the collection. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, but you make decisions there. So when you don't duplicate text, I mean, so in the Escorial, we're talking about having 1 copy of every book that gets produced. But what do you do with, and there's been interesting research about this among people who work on the 19th century, for example. What do you do with highly annotated 19th century romance novels that could tell you all sorts of interesting things about female readers, for example, and communities of readers in the 19th century? But you need 100 copies of the same book across different collections in order to really understand how that works. Mm-hmm. And so how do you convince the funders and administrators, and how do you make the case for keeping that material? And should you keep that material? I'm not a purist either. I don't think you should just keep everything. I think it's reasonable to make a judgment call based on resources and interests, and that's part of the history of librarianship. I mean, the stuff's going to get destroyed eventually anyway. And that also is part of the history of libraries. If I can go back to the 16th century, 17th century for just a moment.
Take us back.
The librarians of the period, they were very concerned about flooding and fire, and nevertheless, those flooding and fire happened all the time. And a large part of the Arabic materials that were incorporated into the Escorial collection in the early 17th century were the result of piracy at the high seas. So the Maghribi collection, the Saadi royal collection, was stolen and then stolen again, and then eventually incorporated into the Escorial. And a very high percentage of that collection, especially those Arabic materials, were lost in a fire in the 17th century. So just to say that I think it's important to think critically and historically about access, about funding priorities, about collection priorities. But nothing's forever, and not only is nothing forever, but what we think is important now, of course, 100 or 200 years from now, will appear insignificant, or the priorities of future generations will change. And so, I'm not going to try and stand in the way of that runaway truck. Rather, I think it's interesting to think about how that process happens, and that's really, I mean, in addition to my interest in the relationship between empire and collecting, or between cosmography and bibliography, I am interested in in thinking historically about how libraries work, and also what counts. Earlier you asked about the activities that happen in libraries. So what counts as library culture? And by library culture, medievalists talk about manuscript culture. People who are interested in book history talk about book culture. There's a bookstore right near Columbia's campus called Book Culture, which you may know. Also, there's a couple of different sites elsewhere. I'm interested in library culture, which is a way of saying I'm interested in libraries, but I'm also interested in the people who move through libraries and what they do in libraries. But I'm interested in library tools, so bibliographic tools, catalogs, as they function outside the library. So for me, I mean, one of my chapters has to do more with lexicography, like people writing dictionaries. And dictionaries are lists, they're catalogs of words. So I'm interested in how the genre of the library catalog, how it works and how it travels outside of the strict context of a building housing books.
Mm-hmm. And part of, as I understand it, what you describe in the book as library culture includes library metaphors, the ways that the metaphors that are used to describe libraries themselves, as well as other objects than the building that houses books, are described as libraries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I sound like too much of a plant. Lauren, don't forget to ask me about library metaphors.
I thought I did it really smoothly.
Thank you for doing that. So ancient theologians, Christian theologians in the early medieval period and early modern humanists described many surprising things as libraries, including the Bible. The Bible was occasionally described as a holy library. So that's a metaphor. The Bible is a collection of books, right? The canon is a catalog. So that's a library in a metaphorical way that has become lost to us. But I think it ought to be part of the history of libraries. Likewise, and this will be sort of less paradoxical perhaps, but other collections, multi-volume works were sometimes and are still sometimes described as libraries. And so the library as a metaphor it suggests some kind of comprehensiveness. It suggests completeness, even if it's not comprehensive. So you might have, you have books of the period called Biblioteca Theologica, Biblioteca, Library of Spain, or Theological Library, and these are specialized works or select anthologies of works on a particular topic or a particular place that suggest here's what you need to know. It's like a World Book encyclopedia, early modern version. Here's short snippets, anthologies, selections of things that might be of interest to you if you're interested in the history of Spain. Mm-hmm. Likewise, here are. Sometimes these collections are thematic, and sometimes they're geographic. Sometimes they're built around particular institutions. But there again, library it's not an actual library. It's a printed text that's described as a library because it has some kind of library function, which is to say that it's a place where you gather together things that might not otherwise be put together, and that there's a claim that putting them together makes sense for a particular intellectual project at a particular moment.
I mean, that's really fascinating. I'm particularly interested in the example of, I think it's Montano, is this right? Who he describes the Bible as a library, both because it's a collection of books, but also it's a sort of encyclopedia of the world itself. That any study of cosmography should begin with a search through the Bible to find the sort of places on the face of the earth that one is interested in thinking or knowing more about. I guess in part I love the contradiction of that, especially in the imperial Spanish context, that sort of by definition, the Spanish are busy sort of pushing into areas of the world that are not mentioned in the Bible itself. So I don't know, I guess I'm just interested, I think, in the kind of claim for the library as a kind of claim for comprehensiveness, even in the face of its inability to achieve that goal.
Yes, that's a nice parallel. So Benito Arias Montano is a fascinating. If you probably have not heard of Benito Arias Montano, but he's a fascinating character, and he wore many different hats for Philip II. He was the editor of this polyglot Bible. He was librarian of the Escorial. He was a Hebraist, a scientist. He had very well developed interest in cosmography. He was buddies with many of the cosmographers based in Northern Europe who were busy mapping, incorporating all the material that was coming from the New World and putting it into, the first atlases of the moment, Ortelius and others. He himself was very interested in the antiquities in Spain and elsewhere, so Mediterranean antiquities. So in order to understand particular inscriptions or architectural ruins or things that found from the ancient world in Spain, you need to understand the ancient names for places. So he became very interested in toponyms, place names, and the changing history of place names. And so that's the connection to the New World. What do you do with New World place names that don't appear in the list of place names that appear in the Bible? And sometimes, there's interesting conversations about the origins of the word Sepharad, for example, which is the Hebrew name that became associated with Spain. Where does it come from? Does it actually mean what we think it means as it appears in the Bible? Does it describe some other location? So interesting kind of humanistic debates of the moment. But Sepharad is one thing. What about Peru? And Benito Arias Montano, he believed that if you read the Bible carefully enough, and if your Hebrew and your Aramaic and even your Arabic were sophisticated enough, that you would be able to access information that previously wouldn't have been accessible. And so he drew parallels between certain moments in the Bible that are Ophir becomes in his mind associated with Peru for various reasons having to do with the history of gold and biblical philology stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's a case of, which comes first, the chicken or the egg here? Is Benito Arias Montano in a kind of facile way making the Bible say things that it doesn't say, or is he finding a middle way for being, to be a man of science because his cosmographic interests were real? His depth of knowledge ran deep, and he knew the geography of the Mediterranean and the New World, mm-hmm. and he knew the Bible well, and so he was kind of finding a way. And I think it's tempting for us to look at him and either dismiss him as him and others, his compatriots, as unwilling to acknowledge the gaps in the Bible, or as too strategically willing to make the Bible say what he knows the science is really telling him. And so, but that's it's that kind of tension that makes someone like Benito Arias Montano so interesting. He also, one of the other interesting things about him is that he wrote it's kind of like an album of important people of the period, with
like
short
a who's who
of early modern humanists, complete with visual material, with images and short poetic snippets. And so in my book, I'm interested in that work of his in particular because to me it seems related to the kind of memory culture that's associated with libraries. Even here, if you spend time in this library, I assume that there are different subject sections, right? If you're interested in a particular topic, I can go to this shelf or that shelf or this area. And as you can see, I mean, you can take a look at the cover of the book later, but the Escorial is organized like that. The paintings that are above the bookshelves are supposed to reflect the contents of the shelves that are below it, and so there's a kind of visual representation of the totality of knowledge. And along with that, in certain parts of the library were paintings of illustrious men that were known for this or that, associated with this or that area of knowledge, which would also help to kind of map the space of the library. So there's a way that those tools of organizing space, they're library tools, but they're kind of rhetorical tools having to do with the art of memory and commonplace tradition. And I mean, maybe that's getting like too deep into the nitty gritty of humanistic methodologies, 16th century nerd stuff. But you can see it reflected. You walk into a library, most libraries, I think that you'll find some version of this, where there's an effort to have the space be organized intuitively so that if you're interested in something, you can find what you're looking for. And that reality has a history, right? In the history of, in library history.
Yeah, it was really striking to me in the cover image of your book, the view of the reading room of the Escorial, that if one didn't know any better, it would be really easy to mistake that view for the nave of a Baroque church, say. And, in this period, churches are often described as sort of cosmographic buildings, right? A microcosm of the entire cosmos itself. I wondered if that is something the library is sort of getting from religious history, if it's sort of doing something new with that idea of a kind of cosmographic totality or comprehensiveness in the actual physical space of the building itself.
Yeah, that's a nice parallel also, because you have these buildings that seek to represent something larger than themselves, and so the nave of a church and the arch ceiling of a library have a lot in common. In the case of the Escorial, the design of the building is fascinating. You walk into one of the main entrances and you pass underneath this room. So the library is on the second floor, and you pass underneath this room and you walk under the library, and then there's a courtyard. On the other side of the courtyard is the monastery's main church. So if you're standing in this room and looking out those windows, you're actually looking directly across the courtyard into the church. Again, I talk a little bit about the architect of the Escorial, but they were thinking about that relationship between library culture and religious culture. I will say too, the field-specific division of the room is one thing, but on either side, theology appears too, as in a kind of privileged position among those paintings. So this is not a it's not a story about the secularization of knowledge, like we might find, politics replacing religion as like the form of communal attachment. It's something a little bit messier.
Even spatially, so it seems to reflect a kind of productive entanglement of both of those cultures rather than the supersession of one by the other. Is there a way that we've talked about some of these library metaphors as examples? Do you have the sense that a sort of the change in the sort of shifting through time of what library metaphors become relevant and get used, do they tell us anything about changing cultural attitudes toward the library?
I'd have to think more about shifting library metaphors after the period that I study in the book, but certainly libraries themselves have changed dramatically and are continuing to change over the course of great conflict, right? Libraries do many things. So part of library culture now, in a way that it wasn't before, I think, is the libraries are becoming emptied of books in many places, right? So we talked about books being moved to New Jersey.
They're all going to New Jersey.
Is it okay? Is this the wrong frame of reference for a conversation in Paris? I feel like it's like a little, America bubble in here. I don't know if it's the wrong frame of reference, but you get the point, which is that libraries are doing other things besides housing books and giving them access to readers. They're spaces for meeting, for having events. They're places for kids to play. They have coffee shops. They offer free computers for people who need them. There's other kinds of social services often that happen in libraries. They're a free bathroom, which is not insignificant in many places. And so, again, I'm not lamenting that shifting meaning of the library. It's not a metaphor, but the meaning of the library. That's I'm not like a Luddite. Like I'm okay with what counts as a library changing, but I'm a book lover and I'm a historian, and I think it's important to really think together about what the priorities are for these institutions, and of course, I mean, a lot of the brouhaha over the last couple of years about libraries has to do with the question of censorship. And a whole different kind of politicized and ideological debate about access, especially in school libraries, which maybe are slightly different. So I'm not under any misimpression that that the talking heads on CNN are going to read my book and come to some realization about how important it is to think historically about library culture. But I think they should think more historically. Maybe not reading my book, but I mean, how are you going to plan for the future of libraries and think about these very difficult questions about who has access to what books and why, without having some sense for where those first of all the many generations that have been having that debate and just having some sense for what those answers were at different moments in time.
Especially at a moment when I think it's become quite recently urgently clear to us that the promise of the digital world as a replacement for the physical book or the physical record is itself a kind of impossible dream. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the cyber attack at the British Library last year, that so many records that were born digital have been lost, right? As a result.
Did you all hear about this?
Yeah, tragedy.
Yeah,
right?
So it has not directly affected my own research, but correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was you couldn't even request a book because they couldn't find it. Right.
I think in a very real way, the sort of the library's own sense of what they have has been irreparably damaged. I mean, I use it's called the English Short Title Catalog all the time as a way of getting a sense of printed text from the early modern period that is gone, just, was wiped away in a second. So the importance of the physical book, I think, right, is something that only a historical view of the library can give us, it seems to me.
Yeah, and it makes you want to have a catalog bound in animal skin on your shelf there, just in case.
Exactly. So I know that we're nearing, I think, the time for questions. So maybe can I lead us into the Q&A with one last question of my own by referencing the question that was the title of this event. Can libraries control the world? Seth, it's time to answer.
I'm sorry to report that my answer to that is no.
Rats.
But I recognize the marketing value of that question. And I have to admit, I mean, I myself am mildly guilty of pushing that angle in my book a bit. I never make the case that there's never a causal relationship in my book between building a library and controlling the world. Even for the Escorial, Philip II, or in the Saadi context, Al-Mansur, were interested in building big collections and copying and gathering manuscripts because it created this impression of imperial power, and it helped to consolidate and publicize the authority of the ruler. So only in the most, I think, indirect of ways can libraries help to control the world. But certainly libraries are part of larger imperial and political projects. So even without the causal relationship, I think there is a kind of grain of truth there.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, who would like to ask the first question? We have librarians present, and everyone here is a book lover. So who would like to ask the first question? Don't be shy. Thank you, Audrey.
We're talking a lot about religious metaphors too, and I find, so I'm a librarian, and I find that modern librarians often talk with religious fervor about our own project. Do you run across that, the kind of sacralization of libraries and librarianship today?
Today in the or in. I mean, you're the librarian. I'm the historian. Yeah, my sense is that that kind of language is largely strategic, right? It's a way of building excitement and consensus and enthusiasm around libraries, and it's a kind of funding tool. Some of my characters from the 16th century, I think it's a little messy. It's a little more confusing because there is a sense that collecting all of the manuscripts of Isidore of Seville and publishing an authoritative version, or collecting all the old Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts from as old as they can get, and then producing a polyglot Bible will have real theological effect. And cause theological dispute. So in some ways, I think what you're describing, that kind of language, the sacralization of library, and also this is something that you were kind of bringing up with your question about the space of the library. In some ways, I think it's even more interesting in the past because there was a kind of sacred motivation there, even for the people who were doing library work that was not exactly theological in nature. I hope that answers your question.
I worked at the American Library Association for many years, and in a very short space of time, we went from seeing librarians and teacher librarians being held up and respected as pillars of society who helped so many people, to being vilified by a large number of people in the population, and they're being sued and they're being threatened with jail time. Do you see the same kind of thing in the early period that you study, that sort of rapid shift from respect and reverence to vilification?
Yeah, this is a great question. The librarians that I study, it wasn't like a lifetime pursuit. It wasn't their profession. Even Hernando Colón, he was a bibliophile and book buyer, but he employed other, like what we would call librarians, to help him do the cataloging and the organizing. And the names that we have were of people who were famous for other things that passed through his library to help him out for a period of time and then moved on. So that's a way of saying, and even Benito Arias Montano, he's famous in part for being the first librarian of the Escorial, but he resented the job. He preferred to be at his country house outside of Seville working on his theological philosophy of science. So I think the profession didn't exist as it exists today. So there wasn't the same kind of vilification. It was like one of the jobs that people would fulfill in a lifetime of other scholarly pursuits. But certainly, I mean, my aunt is a librarian. She worked for many years in the San Francisco Public Library, in the main library, if you're familiar with that institution, which is an amazing place, but can be a difficult place to work sometimes for some of the reasons you're describing, and it has become, I think, more difficult to work in. So, I think you're right that, hearing you ask the question makes me think that maybe I ought to have thought more. I ought to have worked to historicize more librarianship rather than library culture or libraries, because in the end, when I was thinking about library culture, I wasn't putting particular emphasis on like the office of the librarian, rather the people who were there in dialogue with one another at any given point. But I appreciate the question, and it's. I mean, certainly, I had lots of images of librarians that I know that have been important to me in my mind as I was writing the book.
I have a follow-up question. So, during the time of the Inquisition, how did that impact the libraries and what they were collecting and who was collecting them?
So this is a great question. I failed to mention that one of the other activities that occurred in libraries was the work of censorship. So Benito Arias Montano was involved in writing the index, of prohibited books, and so the organization of books, the collection of books, you can see how that easily would go hand in hand with the work of censorship. The people who best knew the works were in a position to expunge them, but also read them and make them known among their own circuits of, their own networks of intellectuals that they were connected with. So works that were not accessible elsewhere were accessible in the Escorial. I mean, it was a dangerous thing to be circulating works in Hebrew, for example, but to go to the Escorial under the kind of umbrella of Arias Montano, who was a very well-respected figure in the period, there's a certain kind of flexibility there to read things that you wouldn't be able to read elsewhere. So that your inclination is right. That, I mean, we have the sense that the librarian's job is to make knowledge accessible, and that the library's job is to make books available. But in actual fact, there has always been a kind of place for censorship in and around the library.
Next question.
Thanks. Sorry to make you walk. Just sort of on the opposite end in the terms of the time period, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how the heritage of Spain as fairly recently Al-Andalus impacts the creation of sort of world and knowledge building and the inclusion particularly of Arabic texts from these cities that had very recently, for the most part, kind of been transferred, and how that plays into this, the creation of knowledge, but also this idea of censorship.
Yeah, this is a great question. The story of the Arabic collection in the Escorial is fascinating, because you would think that many of the Arabic works there would have been gathered up from various other medieval collections around Al-Andalus. But that actually largely was not the case, that many of those works were destroyed in the final years of Islamic rule in the southern part of the peninsula. And even a good number of Andalusi works, which is to say works that were produced in Al-Andalus when it was controlled by Islamic rulers, were reincorporated into the Escorial collection after they had passed to the Maghreb. So people who left, right, emigrants who were fleeing the advancing Christian forces, or that who decided that it was important to leave the Iberian Peninsula, brought texts with them to the Maghreb, which then became incorporated into this or that other collection, and eventually made their way back into Spanish libraries. So, and that's the case for Saadi materials. So some of the materials I study in the last chapter of the book. So that's kind of counterintuitive, right? That Spain is a place with this long and important history of Islamic scholarship. And there, I mean, I don't want to overstate the case. Of course, there are materials that were salvaged or collected or kept for this or that reason, especially scientific materials, medical materials, things that were perceived to be unthreatening to a Christian audience tended to be kept. But other kinds of materials that were more theological in content were the things that were destroyed. And if they exist in the Escorial collection, it's often, but not always, the case that they were reincorporated later.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, I am not a librarian, and I was a few minutes late, so I apologize if this question is redundant. But I'm wondering if personal libraries have played a part in your research, whether today or in the early modern period. Do you consider those to be a part of library culture? And if so, have you come across any individuals who have cataloged their own libraries? Do you catalog your personal library?
That's so. I'm trying to go through my own Rolodex of libraries I've seen. I have friends and colleagues that have very impressive libraries. I do not. I think part of the reason is part of it's temperamental. I buy books, but I get kind of overwhelmed or intimidated by the prospect of trying to have a book buying project, an organizational, a project of acquiring and organizing my own books. I do experiment sometimes with the way I put my books on the shelf. I'm a teacher, largely in my day job, right? And so I often have books organized by the classes I'm teaching or the research projects I'm working on, rather than by author or even subject. I do see, there's this famous example. They're the bookshelves that are organized by color or whatever. I mean, that was cool, 30 years ago. There were bookstores who were doing that before Instagram, or before Zoom meetings where everybody had to have their bookshelf carefully curated. So I'm not so inspired by that. I'm interested in those libraries that are in upheaval because somebody's using them. Those are the studies, the collections, the libraries that are messy on the shelf. I mean, the ones that I'm most taken with are the ones that have signs of constant use.